So a couple people might trickle in later on, but we're just going to get started. So once again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to inform you all that tonight's event will be recorded. So if you don't want to be shown in the recording, feel free to take the time right now to turn off your cameras. And another note for everyone is to please stay muted during the program and during our speaker's presentation out of courtesy. We'll have time after the presentation for a Q&A, so you can save your questions for that portion or feel free to type them in the chat. And then additionally, if you'd like to view the closed captions during the event, you can click on the live transcript button at the bottom of the menu on Zoom. So with that being said, my name is Mika Chan. I'm one of the co-chairs of Student for Solidarity's Education and Advocacy Committee, and I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Maha Hilal, in her book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. So to give a quick bio on Dr. Hilal, she's a Muslim and Arab American human rights and critical national security scholar. Dr. Hilal is a researcher and writer on institutionalized Islamophobia and author of her book, which we'll be learning more about today. Her writings have appeared in Vox, Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, Newsweek, Business Insider, Truth Out, and many more. She's a founding executive director of the Muslim Counterpublics Lab, former co-director of Justice for Muslims Collective, and was previously the inaugural Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. Dr. Hilal is also an organizer with Witness Against Torture. She earned her doctorate in May 2014 from the Department of Justice, Law, and Society at American University in Washington, D.C. And she received her master's degree in counseling and her bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So to go into a little bit of a bio on her book as well, Dr. Hilal addresses the catastrophic impact and shares her insights on the last 20 years of the war on terror, including the role of official narrative in justifying the creation of a sprawling apparatus of state violence rooted in Islamophobia, in addition to outlining how vast the war on terror's apparatus is and has become. So she also sheds light centering the war on terror's impact on Muslim and Muslim Americans and how some have internalized oppression, perpetuated collective responsibility, and how the lived experiences of Muslim Americans reflect what it means to live as part of a suspect community. So throughout the book, she also reflects on what it means to dismantle and abolish the war on terror. So with that said, it's my pleasure to introduce and pass it over to Dr. Hilal for her presentation.
Thank you so much, Mika, for the introduction, and thank you, Student for Solidarity, for organizing this book talk and for being in community with myself and other Muslims. I first was in touch with Student for Solidarity at a Guantanamo event where Mike Ishii was one of the speakers. And it was such a powerful event because we were drawing all these connections and intersections in terms of the US's carceral state and how it has impacted different communities across history. So it's really, really powerful, and I'm so honored to be here with all of you today. So let me get my presentation started. So as Mika mentioned, the title of my book is Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. This book is a culmination of the research, writing, organizing, activism that I've done now for about 15 plus years. And it represents, I think, the trajectory of my understanding and how the war on terror has really impacted Muslims and how deeply embedded Islamophobia has always been in this national security apparatus post 9/11. So in my book, I start with this part of a poem. And the poem goes, because night is here, but the barbarians have not come. Some people arrived from the frontiers, And they said that there are no longer any barbarians. And now what shall become of us without any barbarians? These people were a kind of solution. So in a lot of ways, this speaks to the ways in which the United States has historically cultivated fear of different communities, the way that the United States constantly has to target and scapegoat different communities, and how it creates unity through the hatred and antagonism of communities, such that if there isn't a community that we can blame or target, what are we going to do? What will the United States do? Because we thrive when we are able to sustain our systems of violence that target different communities. Whenever I talk about the war on terror, I typically start with a quote from former President Bush's speech on September 20th of 2001, in which he mentions for the first time the phrase war on terror. This is important because when we think about how we ended up where we are today, this speech was reflective and was indicative of a war that was being planned as nebulous, never ending, and unrestricted in terms of the violence it would execute on Muslims and other marginalized communities. In addition, the part where he says specifically at the end of this quote, whether we bring our enemies to justice or justice to our enemies, justice will be done. What this means is that anything the United States deems appropriate in the course of fighting the so-called war on terror should be considered justice. Justice is what we define as justice. There's no objective sense of what justice actually is. Almost 21 years later, although the United States never asks what actually is justice in the war on terror, it's important for us to think about the ways that this term has been leveraged to legitimize the violence of the United States. In that vein, later in 2001, Donald Rumsfeld, as you can see this quote, basically talks about how the United States should essentially be considered blameless in whatever they do to target this terrorist threat, because the responsibility does not lie with the United States. The responsibility lies with those who targeted the United States in the first place. In other words, this narrative is supporting carte blanche violence of the United States. And it's important that these are the sort of narratives that are emerging towards the beginning of the war on terror and are part of shaping the fundamental apparatus. This quote is from President Biden, who last week, as some of you may have heard, announced the extrajudicial assassination of Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was said to be Osama bin Laden's right-hand man and who took over al-Qaeda after Osama was assassinated. And basically what it does is, in similar ways, project the idea that the United States is eternally a victim. We didn't ask for what happened to us, so we can act however we want to. That is not our responsibility. And it is this constant sense of victimhood, we're now talking about almost 21 years later, that continues to fuel and mobilize and sustain the war on terror. So let's think about justice and who's responsible for what. So last week, when Ayman al-Zawahiri was assassinated, President Biden said, now justice has been delivered and this terrorist leader is no more. When the Trump administration extrajudicially assassinated ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, he said last night the United States brought the world's #1 terrorist leader to justice. And finally, when the Obama administration extrajudicially assassinated Osama bin Laden, he said, quote, and on nights like this, we can say to those families who have lost loved ones to Al-Qaeda's terror, justice has been done. So in other words, justice, again, is whatever the United States says it is. And that is so much the case that, for example, when Biden had announced last week Ayman al-Zawahiri's extrajudicial assassination, he didn't even bother to mention the legalities of the assassination. It did not matter whether or not there were laws that would sanction this type of behavior, because simply it didn't matter. All that mattered was that the United States could file the assassination under the guise of justice. And these are some of the perpetual narratives that continue to emerge and be recreated as the war on terror thrives almost 21 years later. So in addition to those broad stroke narratives, in my book, I talk about some of the particular narratives that are weaponized, that have been weaponized in the war on terror. I'm sure many of you are familiar with narratives around this idea that everything changed post 9/11. And why did everything change? Because it was the United States that was a victim of atrocity. There was no actual measurement of everything objectively changing, except for what the US's response to the attacks were. But this was done, right, to assume this hegemonic posture of victimhood that, again, allowed it to unleash unrestricted violence. Civilization and freedom. The United States not only claimed, right, the dominant narrative was that not only was civilization and freedom a reason why the attacks had occurred in the first place, the terrorists were jealous of our freedom, it was also the reason why we had to act in the way that we did. Because we had to bring civilization and freedom to these countries that we were bombing. American exceptionalism, we all know those narratives. No matter what the United States does, it is always the exception to the rule. Muslim humanity and rage. I'm going to go a little bit deeper into rage in the next slide. But there's this ever-present idea that Muslims only have one particular emotion, and that's rage. And what does it mean if Muslims only have one emotion, which happens to be rage? It means that you cannot reason with them, and that the only logical intervention, therefore, is brute force. And finally, terrorism and moral equivalencies. So who gets to construct what terrorism is? Who gets to weaponize that definition? Who gets to leverage that definition? And the idea of moral equivalencies fundamentally being about the idea that state violence is inherently superior and more moral to non-state actor violence. So these are some of the earlier headlines that have appeared at different points in the last 21 years about Muslim rage. Among the arguments that are made are that, colonization is over. Muslim countries have had the chance to move on. Why are they still angry? We simply cannot understand the anger of these people. And because we cannot understand them, again, we cannot reason with them. Moral equivalencies. I'll give you a second to read this quote. But again, it's the idea that state violence is inherently superior and more moral than non-state actor violence. If we replace the United States with terrorist, this quote would nevertheless describe the actions of the United States. The United States has killed plenty of innocent women and children. That is not what separates the violence of the state and the violence of non-state actors. So when we think about the ways that state violence is positioned as morally superior, it's essentially just an assertion that it is, without any objective measurements of what makes that case. And these similar kinds of quotes and narratives have perpetually appeared, right? Because we simply cannot be the same as those other people. They are barbarians, right? We are not. And we always have to separate the others from who we are. We are who we are because of what we're not, and because of the others whose attributes we do not share. You've probably heard also in the course of the War on Terror, tautological definitions of terrorism. Does anyone know what looks, smells, and kills like terrorism is terrorism? What does that even mean? So terrorism is whatever we say is terrorism, which is tautological. And because of the amount of fear that has been injected into the narrative, these tautologies are allowed to persevere. And it is the state, again, that has the upper hand in defining what terrorism is. If we used objective measurements of what we might consider terrorism, then of course, we know that it would apply just as much to state violence. So all of these narratives work in conjunction, among other things, to make Muslim life disposable. And I don't talk a lot about this specifically in the book because I continue to think about, as the War on Terror is perpetuated, how do we understand the purpose of these narratives? A lot of times in the sort of narrative space, we talk about owning our stories or defining our stories for ourselves. And while I understand sort of the scope of those conversations, to me, sometimes there's something missing, which is that there is a specific type of violence, narrative violence, that's utilized by the state to legitimize and justify the targeting and harm of certain communities. So it's not about us owning our stories. It's not about us telling our stories, right? And there's space for that. But what I'm talking about specifically is how it is a form of violence to utilize these narratives. So what does it mean to be disposable? The United States treats many communities as disposable, right? But these are some of the characteristics that stood out to me when I was reading about this concept in terms of how Muslims have been constructed. So their lives are unremarkable, inconsequential, irredeemable, ungrievable, and legally sanctioned as sacrificial targets of the state as a means to its national security ends. So this to me is an important way of understanding the purpose and intention behind these narratives. Because if you can construct communities as disposable, then harming them is inconsequential. So let's look at a couple ways that this has happened. So when the Abu Ghraib, they usually call it a scandal, but really what it was war crimes. When the war crimes of Abu Ghraib were revealed, there were multiple official responses from government officials, including by Bush, Rumsfeld, and Colin Powell. If you take a second to read each of the quotes, you might notice that there's something that seems remarkably absent. To me, what is remarkably absent is any mention whatsoever of those Iraqis who were victimized and targeted in the war crimes that occurred at Abu Ghraib prison. Instead, the express focus is on rehabilitating the US's image around the world. And it's particularly egregious when we see Colin Powell's quote about America doing the right thing. America never does the right thing. And this is yet another example. And it's as if history doesn't exist when these narratives are being constructed. In 2006, 3 prisoners at Guantanamo, there's debate as to whether or not they were murdered or died by suicide. But it was promoted by the US government as acts of suicide. And in response to those suicides, Rear Admiral Harry B. Harris said, quote, "They are smart, they are creative, they are committed. They have no regard for life, either ours or their own. I believe this was not an act of desperation, but an act of asymmetrical warfare waged against us." I bring in this quote because even an act like suicide, which most people would understand as an act of desperation, is used to construct these 3 individuals as warriors in the struggle for jihad. They are simply terrorists. They died by suicide because they wanted to wage war. So even post-mortem, there is no humanity afforded to Muslims. And of course, Guantanamo exists as one of the most egregious examples of this. I believe it was in 2012, where there was a massacre of civilians in Afghanistan. And in response to the massacre, you can see what Obama said, basically trying to say that this is sort of an exception to the rule. And we should remember that, the United States is making sacrifices for Afghanistan. We might want to ask the question, sacrifices for whom? Sacrifices for the Afghans who have been killed, or sacrifices for those who have been left behind to watch their country be destroyed by the greatest imperial power at this point in history? So sacrifices for whom? Last year, when there was an attack on American troops by a group named ISIS-K, Biden responded with the quote that you see at the bottom. And what's always interesting about these sort of quotes is usually they quantify the number of American troops who have died while leaving the number of civilians who have died ambiguous. Because it simply, again, does not matter. Their lives are inconsequential. And when this story broke out last August, the story was consistently about the 13 American troops who were killed alongside X number of Afghan civilians. As if the United States does not have the capability, right, to actually count and take into consideration how many civilians were killed. So all of this, as I mentioned, all of the war on terror is undergirded by institutionalized Islamophobia. And part of the motivation for me when writing this book was to mainstream this analysis of Islamophobia in the war on terror. That is to say that if you're going to talk about dismantling or abolishing the war on terror, you cannot do that without simultaneously addressing, dismantling, and abolishing Islamophobia. So what is Islamophobia? I focus on the concept of social constructions. So it's the idea that there are particular social constructions that are built into structures of the state and society for the pursuit of power and the justification of war and repression. It's also based on these social constructions that I'm sure many of you have heard of. Islam is violent, it's barbaric, it's uncivilized, it stands in opposition to normative democratic values, right? That Muslims are inherently angry, terroristic, evil, etc. It's also about pushing and positioning Muslims outside of moral boundaries. And when you get pushed outside of moral boundaries that exist for other communities, it becomes acceptable to harm them. And that's why we have seen, right, in the history of the United States, whenever policies and narratives have been unleashed in a particular way, there is very little revolt or challenging because of the demonization and dehumanization that's inevitably built in. And then finally, Muslims are a very diverse community. So it is often difficult to distinctly isolate what it is that we're talking about when we talk about Islamophobia, because Muslims exist at different intersections. But to me, one of the most important pieces of this is anti-religious animus. That is specifically that there is prejudice, antagonism, and bigotry towards Islam as a faith in particular. So this seems like an easy question now that I've talked for about 25 minutes, right? What is the war on terror? That seems like a question we should all be able to answer. And I myself asked this question when I was writing the book, obviously. What is the war on terror? But there's a particular way the United States has sought to construct the war on terror as narrowly being about militarism and warfare abroad, when in reality, it has been a multi-pronged approach to combating the, quote, terrorist threat. There was, I think, a conversation, at least, maybe, I'm not sure what year it was in, but around the 1033 program recently, maybe it was last year or the year before. And there was this narrative of the war on terror is finally coming home to the United States. Well, the war on terror has always been in the United States. It has been fought domestically since its beginnings, whether we're talking about immigration policies, detention policies, etc. So this particular definition is about understanding the landscape of the war on terror as domestic and foreign, and also about how they interplay with one another. I also talk about, to break down the war on terror a little bit further, that the war on terror has 5 dimensions on which it is being fought: militarism and warfare, draconian immigration policies, surveillance, federal terrorism prosecutions, and detention and torture. And going back to the goal of dismantling and abolishing the war on terror, we have to know precisely what it is. Not that my concept is, the final definition, right? There are a lot of ways to conceptualize the war on terror. But to begin to put some boundaries on how we understand it, because it is so vast and nebulous. So what do we mean when we say dismantle and abolish the war on terror? Which part of it? How are different dimensions interacting with other dimensions? How do we actually take down this system? And while I don't necessarily have the answer to that question, to me, conceptually, it was important to lay out sort of this blueprint of what it actually is. Oh, sorry, the wrong way. So corresponding to the dimensions are the modes of violence. And there are 5 modes of violence that I'll go into briefly: corporeal, bordered, panoptic, juridical, and carceral. So I'll talk a little bit about what each mode of violence means, how I define each mode. And as you can see, there's quotes, and there will be quotes on each of the slides. So corporeal violence is part of militarism and warfare, and it's where the state exercises its control of the means of violence directly through the infliction of both psychological and physical harm, as well as death, including by the military. And of course, we have this great quote from President Obama, who's bragging about being able to murder people. Bordered violence via draconian immigration policy. This is also a direct exercise of state power in terms of sovereignty, but here, control of physical borders is leveraged against targeted groups through coercion, such as by restricting immigration or conditioning status on cooperating with state objectives. Panoptic violence. Does anyone remember Ahmed the Clock Boy? The story of Ahmed the Clock Boy? He was a young Sudanese student who had built a clock and brought it into school. And instead of his teacher treating him as a very intelligent, ambitious young man, they instead called law enforcement. And Ahmed left school in handcuffs. Obama, nevertheless, who spearheaded the Countering Violent Extremism program, which is entirely rooted in surveillance, tweeted in support of Ahmed. Again, even though the irony is that he created and spearheaded the program that allowed for this type of surveillance to occur. So panoptic violence is when the state uses its power to surveil in order to control targeted groups by denying them the autonomy inherent in the ability of a person to conduct a private life with the certainty that the state, at least, is not a threat to their safety. Juridical violence, including but not limited to federal terrorism prosecutions, So in this context, juridical refers to the procedural power of the state to deny its victims legal recourse, including by barring access to the justice system altogether or by wielding the judicial process against them. And if you're curious about this quote, it's from the sentencing hearing of a Muslim pharmacist who was charged and convicted with material support for terrorism. Because of material he had translated of Al-Qaeda independently. And of course, the state argued that he had done this at the behest of the group. So this is a really powerful quote because it really speaks to what are Muslims allowed to say and believe? And what are the things that they say and believe? And the ways, perhaps, that some think of justice that will inevitably lead to the conclusion of a denial of justice. And then finally, carceral violence in the form of detention and torture. So carceral refers to the state's physical control over the bodies of its victims, which facilitates the ability to inflict harm in various ways, from the psychological harm of being detained, often indefinitely and without cause, to the use of torture. And obviously, there is some overlap between carceral violence as a mode of violence and corporeal violence as a mode of violence. So I know we don't have a whole lot of time, so I'll end with this slide here. Well, there's one more, but it's very brief. And the reason I included this slide, which as you can see is an image of graffiti, and this is actually a wall of graffiti in Yemen, in which there is writing in both English and Arabic below a US drone, a painting of a US drone that says, "Why did you kill my family?" And I juxtapose that against two quotes. So the first quote is from former President Bush, who said, on 9/11, "Today our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature." And then 13 years later, Obama said, "We can't erase every trace of evil from the world, and small groups of killers have the capacity to do great harm. That was the case before 9/11, and that remains true today. And that's why we must remain vigilant as the threats emerge." And I juxtapose the quotes against this image because it's demonstrative of the fact that whoever has the power to construct the terms on which the war is fought has the power to legitimize and justify their violence. Using the word evil as implication of an inherent characteristic justifies the use of drone violence. And the United States has carefully constructed a narrative of the war, when it started, where history began, who are the protagonists, who are the antagonists, why do they hate us, and the list goes on, in order to justify violence against Muslims and other marginalized communities. So now we find ourselves almost 21 years into the war on terror. And although the war on terror seems nebulous and endless, and as I wrote in a recent op-ed, almost seems ridiculous to ask, when is the war on terror going to be over? That still means that we need to fight back and resist the apparatuses that have been so normalized since 9/11 and building on history in the targeting, of course, of many other communities in this country. So this is about denormalizing what has become the status quo of state violence in the war on terror as a culmination of all US wars past. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Halal. If anyone has questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, or you can also drop them in the chat as well. But to start us off, I have one question. So I was wondering, so I know you start your book and this presentation with the narrative of, like the victimization of the US during the war on terror. And I was wondering if this narrative could be tied to a single individual, or if it's just like, just like history itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like what Bush in particular did, right, is to develop a blueprint of the war on terror in terms of policies and narrative. And then all subsequent presidential administrations simply reiterated those very same things. And that's one of the reasons why I looked at this concept of justice specifically in the context of extrajudicial assassinations, because it's the same language that's being repeated in different contexts, but to sustain the same sort of violence in the course of the war on terror.
Thank you. Is that me? Sorry.
No, that's me.
Okay.
There's not a fire. My mom is just cooking something.
And then my other question is, oh, sorry, I'm just reading what Stan put in. Yeah, I agree, Stan. And then my other question is kind of tied to your book, but in the conclusion of your book, I know you mentioned that applying an abolitionist lens to the war on terror has its complications because its scope is so massive. And I'm really curious about this because in Suru we talk a lot about abolition. And so do you mind elaborating a little on some of the shortcomings of viewing the war on terror from an abolitionist perspective?
Well, I think it's not necessarily like a shortcoming. I think it's just hard to disentangle at this point, right, what the war on terror is. So when 9/11 happened, I was 18, for example. Now, when I talk to young Muslim Americans, right, who are maybe just starting college, they don't have the same experience and visceral reaction to the war on terror because they simply haven't had that experience. In addition, right, there's this normalization, right? Like now we go to the airport and we just go through the body scanners, right? There's a lot of things that we no longer even think about because it's been so normalized. So I think part of it is just hard to really disentangle and get to the root of what this war has meant. And obviously complicating that, right, is that this is not new in terms of the United States inflicting violence on different communities, right? So we can disentangle and we can look at the unique ways that the post 9/11 national security apparatus was built and sustained. But then we also know, right, there's this long history of its leveraging against other communities. So how do we begin to tackle that? And that doesn't mean, right, that we don't work towards abolition. But there's always this constant struggle, right? When we're talking about to what extent do we have to work with the state to achieve certain ends, whether we're talking about prisoners being transferred out of Guantanamo, right? Or the wars on Muslim majority countries ending. And how do we work outside of the state then to bring some of these changes? And these are all, ideas and concepts that I have found very difficult, right? Because a lot of the issues we work on require a certain sense of urgency and immediacy. And so how do we appropriately tackle them with abolition in mind? And I know that there's, Miriam Kaba and a host of other writers, right? Ruth Wilson Gilmore, that talk about abolition. And so, I've obviously been thinking about a lot of this, and, really curious also to see like what you guys have talked about, like how do we do abolitionist work in these spaces that are often very immediate and urgent and require, unfortunately, right, some level of work with the state. I don't know if that answered your question.
I think it is. I have to really think about it, but it's like a question I think about a lot. So thank you. And then I think Celeste put out a question, so I'll read it out loud. So Celeste says, I was so struck by what you were saying about how it could even sound ridiculous to ask when the war on terror would ever end, since it feels like it's been normalized my entire life. As we educate and raise future generations of kids, what do you think are some of the best ways to teach about the current US machinations of war and Islamophobia?
That's a really good question. And, I think one of the ways to not do it, and I'll start with that, is from a sort of an anecdote that I had spoken to a Muslim parent whose students were in the Virginia school system. And every day in September, they had a lesson about 9/11. And obviously, there are a few lesson plans that exist, right, on 9/11 that don't involve some sort of tethering to the identity of being Muslim and what that means. So I think, it's tricky. I'm not sure. I don't have kids myself, so it's not something that I, particularly have a lot of developed thoughts on. But I think teaching Muslim kids, for example, to be proud of their identity. I think similar to other communities, right? Teaching them about the ways in which our community has been ostracized, antagonized, and, kind of in some ways preparing them for the ways they might think about and learn about their community. I think, there are probably people that are better equipped to talk about, what are some of the best ways. I think for older groups of students, I know that Penn State, and I contributed to a curriculum around 9/11, had put out a curriculum around the post 9/11 atmosphere and climate. So bringing in people, right, who have been impacted in some way because of their identity as Muslim or other marginalized communities, who can really speak to the experience and who can really push back against the idea that the United States didn't have a choice as to how it fought this war. And I think, when we're talking about curriculums, right, there's a lot of ways that curriculums are extremely racist and preserve particular histories of the United States. And that's a whole big fight in and of itself, right? How do we learn about who we learn about, right? There's a long discussion and a lot of work that's being done on that. But I think figuring out ways to teach the truth and history of this country in ways where the United States isn't the inevitable and sole victim of mass atrocity, right? And also the idea that the United States doesn't have to engage and interact with the world in the way it does. In other words, it doesn't have to be this way. There is another way that the United States and the people that live within its borders can engage with each other and other people across the globe. I know there was a comment from Stanley that I just want to acknowledge and just briefly comment on, that this is a sort of very prescient narrative in the Muslim community and sort of discussion along the lines of Muslims participating in, different state agencies, working for them, supporting them, engaging with them, allowing them access into the community, et cetera, et cetera. And there's always this discussion of, we need a seat at the table, right? I'm sure a lot of you have heard this, right? If we don't have a seat at the table, then we'll be on the menu. I always respond, you can have a seat on at the table and also be on the menu. Those two are not exclusive. And so when we talk about, there's a lot of excitement about Muslims in Congress. And I agree it's a great start if we have to deal with a state system, right? We're stuck in that for now. When we talk about Muslims as a marginalized community being engaged with the state in ways that perpetuate harm against our communities, obviously, we should not consider that an achievement and an accomplishment. And so that's why specifically I wanted to talk about in my book, which I didn't talk about today, Internalized Islamophobia. Because if we talk about dismantling Islamophobia, we have to specifically and explicitly address the ways that Muslims are perpetuating the violence against their own community.
Thank you, Dr. Halal. I know Mike had his hand up before, so I'll pass it to you, Mike.
This is so rich. There's so many things I want to talk to you about based on what you've discussed and so many questions. I'll try to keep it, somewhat limited because I know there's others who have questions too. I just want to first say that I lived through 9/11. I was in New York City. I saw the whole thing happen. And what was interesting to me was the immediate reaction was not one of revenge. It was one of helping each other. And it was what I think is the inherent adverse response to violence of human beings who actually want to care for each other and not hurt each other. And it wasn't until there was a very systematic manipulation of people around the killing of police officers and firemen and a call for revenge in their name that it flipped. And when New York City flipped, everything else flipped. And I watched it happen, and I was really struck by the power of the state to frame that narrative. Anyway, I so appreciated your framing of this in the terms of violence, because I think that's actually the most accurate way to objectively describe what's actually going on. I found it very refreshing. And my question was, I also really appreciated your discussion of internalized oppression in the book. And I know you're a counselor by training. Also, I have a counseling background myself. And, when I think about the surveillance, the mass shootings, the forced removals and detention of people, the roundups, our community has a similar history in that sense. How do you think about the way forward out of community trauma? Because your community, just by the way you're dressed tonight, there's a bullseye on you. And we're not new to that either. And we do healing circles, and we're trying to develop sort of forms to give people in our community a chance to try to talk with each other about how this has impacted us as individuals, transgenerationally. I'm just curious what you're thinking about that and the way forward in healing for your community and maybe your family or yourself or people you know.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that really important question. And and I know it's something we all think about a lot. And to me, the question of healing always involves the question of how do we, heal an injury when it continues to be inflicted. And, I know from counseling, like obviously healing is not a linear process, but sometimes part of the healing process, right, is most effective when the trauma is no longer happening. And so how do you operate in the system of healing people, right? When they're continuously in the context that caused them harm in the first place. And, that's something I struggle with a lot of times when there's been attacks against Muslims, violence against Muslims more generally. Different Muslim organizations will hold healing spaces. And I always understand the immediacy and the urgency of the spaces being held. But I also sometimes wonder, is a one-time healing session going to do it? How do we, develop a longer process of healing, both in understanding the complexity, right? And understanding that the injury isn't over. So how do we sustain ourselves knowing the injury isn't over? And also, I think a lot of times when there's general healing spaces that are being, conducted, there's a sense of collective trauma that's being addressed, which is really important and very real. But sometimes that takes away from the individual trauma. And so to me, it's always important to focus and make sure, right, that individuals feel cared for in these spaces and that they can kind of, let me just digress for a second, because there's this idea that tends to bother me around resilience, and people are always celebrating resilience of people and communities in the face of adversity. And that always seems to somehow come back to sort of maligning the people that aren't resilient, the people who don't emerge from being tortured and detained as, functioning, having a job, getting married, sustaining their families. It's sort of used against them. So I think about this just because, I think while we're caring for the collective, I think we also have to make clear, right, that the individual is often a person who's very traumatized. And how do we address that on its own, right? Knowing that people are reacting to situations differently. But I think just generally the longevity and really thinking about what does long-term healing look like, and not sort of one-off events, or not sort of, something that happens, every 2 months or something like that, like really thinking about and exploring. And I don't know, perhaps there's already, I'm sure there's probably research on this, and how do you actually heal when you're in a constant state of injury? And I don't know that, I have the answer, right? And if it means that you have to sort of quote, help people become more resilient, I don't know what that means. And I'm not really sure if I'm, sort of answering your question. I think I'm just always stuck on, what does healing mean? And it's kind of like when you're in an environment that's set up for healing, and you can feel like you're whole, and you can feel like some of the injuries have been treated. And then you walk outside of that situation and the injury comes back. And then how do you cope with that? And this has been sort of an ebb and flow, right? Because when we look at the trajectory of the war on terror in this context, narratives have been different. People interpreted Obama, right? Obama's rhetoric and narrative to be less overtly Islamophobic. But nevertheless, it still was, and it still harmed Muslims. So I'm not sure I'm doing a good job of answering your question. I think, I think I always get stuck on the idea of how to heal when you're in the harmful situation perpetually. How do you pull someone out of that situation? What do you actually do?
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate, your really honest response, because I think you're asking a question that many of us are trying to figure out right now, which is, how do you heal in this state of ongoing injury, which is, I think, what we're all encountering at this moment. I was struck in a recent conversation with another of our book club speakers, Kazuhaga, and it's interesting that in your book you talk about Islam And he was talking about Buddhism, and I think about both of those religions of actually having a very powerful internal spiritual guide to offer a path forward through very turbulent, dark, violent times for the spirit. And I don't know, I see that spirit in you a lot. So thank you.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. I mean, I think of like, it kind of makes me think of all the ways, for example, Muslims are constantly looking for the validation and affirmation of their humanity, and all the times they get disappointed. So when the Supreme Court upheld the Muslim ban, for example, it was a shock, but at the same time, it shouldn't have been a shock. And also then at other points, right? Supreme Court affirmed, for example, habeas corpus rights for prisoners at Guantanamo. So it's also this constant emotional manipulation of different communities. Where's the United States? Where's the government? Where's society going to fall on the question of, are Muslims human and what rights do they deserve? And because there's this ebb and flow, it makes it more complicated to understand, especially if your analysis isn't just that, right? There are particular reasons why humanity is affirmed in some cases, which is inevitably to leverage violence against the very same community. So I think, now that I'm talking about it, now that you, gave me some feedback, I'm also thinking of like political education and in some degree is healing, because it's about knowing the essence of this country and not expecting the United States to affirm the humanity and the rights of Muslims. If you don't expect that, you're less disappointed by it. And that sounds pretty negative, because then where's their hope? But then it's about honoring and building the idea internally that Muslims don't need the state to affirm their humanity or their rights. We don't need the state. And I think that that's really important. The state is not the power that gets to decide whether we are human or not, or whether we are deserving of rights or not.
Thank you, Dr. Hilal. I know we're short on time, so I want to pass it to Lisa's question next. I know you have your hand raised, so if you'd like, take the mic.
Thanks. This has been really wonderful. And I think your last comments have had me sort of thinking about like the distinction between past and present. And I'm sort of like stuck on this Freud's Mourning and Melancholia, where he sort of argues that melancholia is like the inability to get over the thing that you're supposed to be mourning. And then sort of like, critiques of that sort of say like, well, what happens if the thing that you're supposed to be mourning is not done? And so that melancholia may no longer actually be sort of like the failed version of mourning, but like the version that sort of takes into account that like the harm is ongoing or the loss is ongoing. But I think you just so coherently articulate this question about morality and sort of the ability of the state to assert a sort of moral hold on violence and to sort of disguise the violence of the state. And Mike had mentioned our previous book club with Kazu Haga, and I think it sort of raised a lot of questions around what it might mean to be identify as a nonviolent organizer, or to mobilize in sort of a nonviolent way. And I think the best sort of like personal framing I've come to around that is about being able to sort of make a distinction between the state as violent and then sort of responses to state violence as not being like, those cannot be violent. And yet sort of like the public narrative of that places the burden of violence squarely on those responses to state violence. So, not to sort of like make you buy into my conception of nonviolence, but I guess I'm sort of curious, like, sort of in your framing of violence, which I think is so particular, are there things that you found to be effective in terms of trying to change broader narratives around what violence is and isn't, or how to sort of shift other people's understanding around state violence?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, when I think about the concept of Muslim rage, for example, why I sort of underscore that particular construction is because it's really about Muslims reacting abnormally to a situation that other people would have reacted differently to. So for example, if your country was colonized, if you were kicked out of your homes, if half your family was droned, that somehow rage is inexplicable and would only exist amongst Muslims. And so when I talk about violence and the comparison, right, it's not about normalizing the violence. And I know that's not what you're saying. But to me, it's about normalizing certain emotions that come when harm is inflicted on yourself, on your family, on your friends, on your community. And there are a lot of organizations, right, that work on how do we respond to violence. And I think that that's really important work and in line with sort of what you're getting at. But my particular scope really is about normalizing not the violence itself, but normalizing the idea that it is hard to accept violence and injustice that is leveraged against your community. When the United States was attacked on 9/11, Americans, right, more so white Americans, could sit back and watch their country take vengeance on the perpetrators of the attacks. There are so many people for whom no one is there to take justice on their behalf. And so it's about the emotions that arise and what does justice mean? When we get closer to nonviolence, right, we understand that justice can very well be achieved through nonviolent means. But I think it's imperative to understand, right, and really talk with the people with whom, you know, injustice has been inflicted. And I think that's the problem, right? We don't deal with directly most of the time, right? People in Afghanistan whose families have been murdered, people in Iraq, right? People in Somalia whose families have been droned. And what does violence mean to them? It likely means US violence. And so how do we both understand the emotions, again, that arise from the infliction of violence? How do we understand their conception of justice in response? And what are the sort of interventions, right, that in general, all groups need to learn about, right, in order to stop perpetuating violence? So I think it's a really, really good question. And I think, you know, to me, it's really central to understand what does justice mean. And Americans have a specific sense of justice as justice that is taken by their state, right? And they know that their state, I mean, whatever, it's faux justice, but, you know, like there's this concept that we're taking justice on your behalf, meaning that at least the facade of someone caring about how you have been harmed and how you need to feel a sense of justice is there. But that doesn't exist for so many other communities, right? Because we can harm them without consequence and then disregard their calls for justice.
Thank you, Dr. Halal. I want to go back to your point about healing and kind of circle back to Catherine's question in the chat, and I'll read it out loud. But the question is, you mentioned how a lot of young American Muslims don't remember the beginning of the war on terror. So how do you see the role of intergenerational organizing in healing and community building and pushing back against Islamophobia?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. And I think with all social justice movements, right, it's imperative that we connect to the struggles of different generations, because obviously the violence of 9/11 did not emerge on its own, right? It was built on the apparatuses that had been built before. So I think it's really important. And I also think, when we really examine and engage with different generations who've experienced conflict and violence in different ways, it opens our eyes to the sort of conversations that need to be had. So I know, for example, many Muslim/Arab immigrants that I've interacted with will say things like the United States is better off for us than the countries we came from, which were authoritarian and dictatorial, right? And it's as if it's either that or this. And it's as if the violence of the United States cannot possibly compare to the violence that's inflicted or that was inflicted domestically in their home countries. And so understanding, how different generations also based on their positionality, where they grew up, their experiences, understand the violence and the context we're currently in, to build this sort of shared political analysis, I think is really critical. And, I know that I've spoken to, members of my family who have similar ideas, right? Our country, our back home, we would have never been in the same position as we are here. And they'll tell me things like, if you were, back home, my family's from Egypt, you would never be able to say the things about Egypt as you do about the United States. And so how do we sort of disentangle that, right, for the shared political analysis to understand, right, what are perceived as benefits and how they are also consequences, and what does that do for us, right? And if we're working towards this, community and place where we can actually thrive, how do we need to merge these multiple understandings?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think, I don't know, my thought is like a lot of healing also comes from like, you have to be able to like imagine that there's something better than like what we have now. But yeah,
right.
I don't know, it's hard to do sometimes. And I think that's where a lot of like community comes in, and intergenerational bonding, or just like community in general. Also, I'm seeing a lot of great comments here. If you want to unmute and read out loud, please feel free. Oh, Mike, go ahead.
Can I slip in another question? Maha, we met at the CCR 40th anniversary of Guantanamo, and really the call for the release of the prisoners. Can you talk more about that campaign, and what do you think we need to do? What's your take on things?
That's a good question. As all of the questions have been great. I think there's a couple of things. One is to end the atrocity that is Guantanamo. There are different interpretations and ways of closing Guantanamo that make sense, right? Where we understand that there has already been significant violence inflicted at the prison, right? Where people have been tortured, where they've essentially served their time as a result of the atrocious violence they've experienced. And so one part of this is to actually close Guantanamo and to abolish Guantanamo. Because as most of us probably know here, Guantanamo for use with Muslim men is not the first time the naval base has been used to dehumanize, target, criminalize, and detain marginalized communities. So it's not enough to just close Guantanamo. It has to be abolished so that it cannot be used for any other group that the United States decides to exploit and dehumanize. The other part of it is caring for and acquiring justice for the men who've been transferred from Guantanamo. In most cases, the US has all but abandoned these men. There are negotiations and agreements between the United States and host countries, third-party countries, or the individual's own country, which typically the individual who's been transferred is not privy to. So they don't know what their rights are. They don't know what resources they have. In many cases, they don't have jobs. They have no access to education. They can't sustain their family, or they're separated from their family altogether. So it's about justice. And a lot of times we talk about closing Guantanamo as the end goal. And that's not the end goal, because there have been over 740 men who've been transferred out of Guantanamo and who have still not experienced any semblance of justice. And of course, this is a repeated theme in the history of the United States, right? How do we rectify injustices? And there has never been a good example of the United States doing that. But nevertheless, it still is imperative in the case of Guantanamo prisoners, because not only are they transferred out of the prison with few resources on the most part, the United States doesn't vindicate them. So essentially, they live their lives as stigmatized terrorists. In sometimes, for example, there's a former prisoner named Mansour Daifi who was transferred to Serbia. Serbia is extremely anti-Muslim. Other countries where former prisoners have been sent are also anti-Muslim. So how do we actually get justice for the men beyond just closing Guantanamo? And then what are the lessons we have to learn, right, about making sure this prison is not used again? So on my end, and the work that Muslim Counterpublics Lab does, we not only advocate for the closure of Guantanamo, we also focus specifically on the men who have been transferred. So part of our most recent work, in collaboration with Witness Against Torture and No More Guantanamos and HEART, is that we established a Guantanamo Survivors Fund to basically provide financial support to step in where the state has neglected these men. And so again, so sort of thinking about the full spectrum of what Guantanamo entails, both from those who are currently detained and tortured, and those who have been transferred, but have not been able to rebuild their lives in any meaningful sense since they were at Guantanamo.
Thank you so much for that response.
Thank you, Dr. Hilal. I want to start wrapping up around here. If there are any last minute questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. But meanwhile, I'll pass it back to Catherine.
Yeah, thank you again so much, Dr. Hilal, for joining us. And I just wanted to let everyone know that we are going to do the second part of this series 2 weeks from today on August 23rd at the same time. That'll be our book club discussion, and we're going to be focusing on chapters 1 and 5, but we obviously encourage you to read the whole book after you've heard the key highlights. We really encourage you to read the whole book, and we'll be sending out that registration link as well as another list of resources and information about the Muslim Counterpublics Lab and other works by Dr. Hilal. So we'll be sending out the recording and a list of resources to all attendees. Highly encourage you to register for the book club. And then also, if anyone would like to join the Advocacy and Education Committee, we meet every other Tuesday at 5:30 Pacific. So if we could just get another round of applause for Dr. Hilal on this wonderful conversation. Yes, thank you, Mike.
Thank you all so much for organizing the event, for being in community with me, and hopefully, look forward to building stronger connections and connecting the issues that we advocate and fight for our community. So thank you all so much. And really, I really appreciate your time and energy that you spent on a Tuesday night to be here.